which is 5 lines from the bottom, the first wide line.
Yud Tes Amud Beis.
And Yud Tes Amud Beis. Yud Tes Amud Beis. Okay. And that's really where it starts to get easier anyway. So. Okay. Yosef Rav Menashe Bar Zvid Kamed the Ravuna v'Yosef v'Ka'amar. So Rav Menashe Bar Zvid is sitting in front of Rav Huna, and he states as follows. Yeah, you got it? Yud Tes Amud Beis, 5 lines from the bottom. I apologize. I'm sorry. So my taima de Reb Shimon. So the question is, what is Reb Shimon's reasoning? What is Reb Shimon's reasoning? Meaning, we know that Reb Shimon has this differentiation in the case of Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, whether Levi was born before Shimon does Yibum, or if Levi's born after Shimon does Yibum. Ruvain dies, Ruvain's widow falls to Yibum. When Levi is born before Shimon does Yibum, then everyone agrees that there's a problem of Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo. When Levi is born after Shimon does Yibum, then you have a machlokus between the Chachamim and Reb Shimon. The Chachamim say that she's still an Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, such that if then Shimon dies, she would not fall to him to Yibum, she'd still be an Erva. And Reb Shimon disagrees, and he says no. He finds her as, when he comes into this world, he finds her as Shimon's wife, not as Ruvain's widow, and therefore Shimon was his brother that he knew. They were in the world together, and therefore she falls to him for Yibum. So the question now is, my time of Reb Shimon. So the Gemara says, my time of Reb Shimon? What kind of question are you asking? Kida Amar Taima, holu ba'amutza beheter, v'lo amdalav sha'echas be'isr. We already clarified this, is that because according to Reb Shimon, when Levi comes into the world, he finds her as Shimon's wife. There was no point where she was the prohibited widow of Ruvain, whom he had never met. So Elamai time of Rabbanan. So the question really is, now that Reb Shimon has presented his case so effectively, we're having trouble understanding why the Chachamim would disagree with him. Why would the Chachamim still say that to Levi she's an Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo? So the Gemara answers because of a pasuk. Amar Kra ulakacha lo liisha v'yibima. The Torah says that when a man does yibum, he shall take the woman to him as a wife, and he shall be miyabim her. He will do yibum to her. Now, what that pasuk implies is that adayin yivumim harishonim aleha, that there's still some stigma even after Shimon takes Ruvain's widow as his wife. Even if they're married for 20 years, there's still some remnant of the stigma of her being Ruvain's widow, Ruvain's Yevama. And therefore, even though Levi was born after Shimon does Yibum to her, that stigma lingers, and so therefore she's usher to Levi. So Elahadit Nans, and Gemara says, you mean to tell me that a woman always retains her status as of a Yevama, that stigma is always there? So Kansa Hariki Ish L'chol Davar, what about the Mishnah that says that once Shimon does Yibum, this woman is completely his wife, to the sense that this teaches me that if Shimon wants to divorce her, he divorces her. And not only that, but if he wants to remarry her after he's divorced her, he just gives her regular kiddushin. So the Gemara says, Hasam nami lema v'yibima adayin yivumim harishonim aleha v'tiboi chalitza. Why don't you argue that the stigma of being a Yevama still remains upon her, and therefore, if Shimon wants to sever his relationship with her, not only does he have to give her a get, he's got to give her chalitza because she's still got that stigma of being a Yevama. So the Gemara answers because shiny hasam da amar kra ulakacha lo liisha kevin shalekacha nasis keisha lechol davar. The answer is because of the first part of the pasuk. The first part of the pasuk says that when a man does yibum, he takes her to him as a complete wife. And therefore, once she's his complete wife, there's no longer any remnant of her being a Yevama, to the point that where when he wants to divorce her, he gives her a regular get. So ihachi hachanami. So then why don't you say the same thing by Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo? Let's go back to that case. The Gemara says, Hakasav Rachmana v'yibima. Yes, but you have the last word of the pasuk of v'yibima, which teaches me that she does have a stigma. So the first part of the pasuk says no stigma remains. The last part of the pasuk says the stigma remains. So the first part of the pasuk is vis-a-vis her relationship with her yavam husband, And the last word of the pasuk is vis-a-vis her relationship with the unborn brother Levi.
This is close to the Russian Yikach for Mega Kedushin.
Yes, ulakacha. That's he takes her as a wife. Yeah, exactly. So frek the Gemara umarois. Why are you seemingly indiscriminately applying the first pasuk to her husband Shimon, and the last part of the pasuk to her as of yet unborn brother Levi? The Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Mistavra shadi hetera ahetera v'shadi isura aisura. It just makes more sense to say that the first part of the pasuk, which is giving you a heter, to say that she's now your complete wife, there's no longer a stigma, is referring to a case where there is no outstanding problem in the relationship because Shimon is a regular brother and is doing regular yibum. In that case, then the pasuk which is permissive would be applying to that regular case. Whereas it just logic dictates that the latter part of the pasuk, which is indicating some level of stigmatic restriction, is referring to an abnormal or some kind of problematic case, like an unborn brother. So that's the reason where it says that's what it just makes sense to say that. Okay, so that explains the Chachamim Shita as to why Eishes Ach Shelahayu Ba'olamo remains intact even though Levi was born after Shimon did Yibum. But now I have a question now according to Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon, you say that since Levi finds this woman no longer as Reuven's widow but now as Shimon's wife, she's sort of been whitewashed from her past. And therefore, if Shimon dies, he can marry her, he can do yibum to her. So my question to you is, will Reb Shimon, the Amar Ha'olu Ba Mitzah Be'eter V'lo Amda Alav Sha'echas Be'isser Ela Me'ata? So now let me ask you a question. Achoso me'imo shenasa achiv me'aviv v'achar kach nolad achu meis. Tisyabim Ha'olu Ba Mitzah Be'eter. The Gemara is asking a very interesting question. What about the following scenario? You got three brothers. One brother hasn't yet been born, but you got Reuven and Shimon who are alive, and Reuven marries Rachel, and Reuven then dies. Shimon does Yibum. I'm sorry, you've got three brothers. All three brothers are alive. Sorry. Reuven. I'm sorry. No. Levi's not alive yet. Reuven marries Rachel. Reuven dies. Shimon does Yibum to Rachel. And then Reuven and Shimon's dad gets married to a second wife who happens to be Rachel's mother. And, which is perfectly legal, right? You can marry your machatenister, right? If both of you are available. I actually know of a case where a man and a woman got married, and the boy's father was an alman, and the girl's mother was an almana, and they got married. You know, it happens. So Reuven and Shimon's dad marries the machatenister Rachel's mother, and then they have a child together, and that's Levi. So then Shimon dies. And Levi is Shimon's brother from the father, but he's also Rachel's brother from the sister. So the question that we have is that if the fact is that when Levi comes into the world, he doesn't encounter Rachel as his sister, he encounters Rachel as his brother's wife. So why don't we say, just like we can whitewash the stigma of being a Yevama, we can also whitewash the stigma of being a maternal sister. So therefore, if Shimon dies, why don't we let Levi do Yibum with his sister? That's the Gemara's question. His half-sister, right? His maternal sister. That's the question. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, Isser Achosa Leichanazal. What are you going to do with the Isser of Achosa? What, you think he just vanished into thin air? So the Gemara says, but Hachanami Isser Achiv Shalahayu Balamu Leichanazal. But that's what you're saying. You're saying you whitewash away the Isser of Eishes Ach Shalahayu Balamo, the fact that Reuven's widow was an Eishes Ach Shalahayu Balamo. That gets whitewashed by virtue of the fact that Shimon marries her. So why don't you say the same thing? The Isser of Achoso gets whitewashed just because Shimon married her. So the Gemara says, well, there's a basic difference. Hi Isura de Lesle Hetera, Hi Isura de Isle Hetera. It's very, very, very clear, the Gemara says, that the Isur of Achoso is never removed for any purpose. The Torah never removes the erva of Isur Achoso, the prohibition of your sister. The Torah occasionally removes the Isur of Eishasach when there's a mitzvah of Yibum. So that's why it's logical to conclude that Eishasach Shalahayo Ba'olamo, that erva should be removed for the sake of Yibum when she's sort of purified or whitewashed through her marriage to Shimon. But you can't remove any erva just because she's married to Shimon. Okay, let's go on to the next mission.
In years, the difference in years.
Well, sure, there's a big age difference, but Mr. Gruda, age is not significant, right? You know that. Right? That's right. I have. If you want, I have many shidduchim for you whenever you're ready. Okay. Next Mishnah. Klal Amru Biyavama. So the Mishnah now tells me a rule. The Mishnah tells me a general rule, a klal. Kol she'isura isur erva lo chotzetzes v'lo misyabemes. Anytime a woman's isur to the yavam is through erva, meaning that they're related to each other, so then there's no chalitza and there's no yibum. However, isur mitzvah v'isur kedusha. But if the Isser is not an Isser Erva, but rather it's of a different nature, it's mitzvah or Kedusha, which we'll define momentarily, then, since it's a lesser form of prohibition, the woman is subject to Chalitza, she's just not subject to Yibum. Now, Achos shehi yavimta choletzes o misyabemes. And here's the next halach of the Mishnah, that if you have two sisters that are married to two brothers, normally we had said before that if two brothers die and their wives fall to Levi, Reuven and Shimon die, and their wives who are sisters to each other both fall to Yibum to Levi, we don't allow either of them to do Yibum. You have to do Chalitza to each one because of Acho Zikukaso, because each one is a sister of a woman that you have Zika with, right? However, that's only true if there's going to be Zika with both sisters. Let's say, however, you have a situation where one of the sisters happens to be an erva to you in addition to being your brother's wife. So let's say there are two sisters and one of them happens to be your daughter-in-law, your former daughter-in-law. Okay? Or she happens to be your mother-in-law. Okay? So in that situation, since one of the sisters does not even have Zika to you, you can do full Yibum to the other sister. And there's no longer a problem of Achaz Zikukas. Now, I don't know why this line is dafka inserted here in this part of the Mishnah, probably because it's telling me the difference between when there is Zika, when there's not Zika, but it's just an important, an interesting insertion. Next, now what is the definition of Isser Mitzvah? The definition of Isser Mitzvah means Shenios Medivrei Sofrim. It means when there's a rabbinic prohibition to marry a woman because she has some level of relation to you, but not one that the Torah proscribes. So, for example, the Torah prohibits a daughter and a granddaughter, but the Torah does not prohibit a great-granddaughter. So, how do you know that she's prohibited? She's not. But the Rabbanan came along, the early Sofrim came along, and they said that anyone who's a descendant of yours is prohibited. But it's Asr Midirabbanan, it's not Asr Midioraisa, and therefore there is Zika, and therefore you can't just say she gets off scot-free, but rather there's going to be Chalitza. And Isser Kedusha, what does that mean? Almana l'kohen gadol grusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedjot. So two examples, basically when there's only a mitzvah lo saseh, there's no Isser kares involved in the relationship. So for example, Reuven and Shimon are both kohanim. Reuven dies and Shimon happens to be a kohen gadol. So because this woman is an almana, is a widow, even though there's a mitzvah of yibum, but there's a prohibition for a kohen gadol to marry an almana. So therefore he does chalitza, not yibum. Another example would be if Reuven and Shimon are kohanim and Reuven is a sinful kohen and he goes ahead and marries a divorcee. So they're halachically married even though they're married in sin. So if Reuven dies, she does fall to Yibum for Shimon, but because Shimon wants to observe halacha, he can only do chalitza, he can't do Yibum. Two other examples are Mamzeres Unasina Li Yisrael, Ubas Yisrael Unasinu Mamzer, that in a situation where either my brother is a mamzer or in a sin, or the woman that he's married to is a mamzer or in a sin, then I can only do chalitza to the woman that he was married to. So, where we know what a mamzer is a product of an erva relationship. A nesin we really haven't defined yet, but it's also someone who is forbidden to me because of some taint in their lineage, which we'll have to discuss later on, whether it's a Samaritan or whether it's some other kind of Jew whose ancestry is in question. Therefore, you can only do chalitza, you cannot do yibum. Let's take a look at the Gemara now. Klal la'asuye mai. So when the Mishnah lists, sometimes when it tells me that there's a klal, as a general rule, it's usually coming to be inclusive of something. What is it coming to be inclusive of? Amar Rav from Bar Papa, la'asuye tzaras ailanis uchad Rabbi uchad Rav Asi. It's coming to include the law of tzaras ailanis, that a tzara of an ailanis does not fall for yibum, just like an erva does not fall for yibum, and therefore is not subject to yibum or chalitza. This goes according to Rav Asi, who says that really technically the din of ailanis or tzaras ailanis could have been added to our Mishnah, because he learns that that she has to, a woman can only fall to yibum if she's capable of reproducing. But if she's infertile, then the mitzvah of yibum does not apply to her, and therefore she becomes just a standard eishes achuz in erva to me, and therefore her tzara is also prohibited. And so therefore, the klal is inclusive of any woman whose stigma is because of erva, including a tzaras ailanis, who's now an erva because she's the co-wife of an eishesach. V'ika da amri, others learn kol she'isura iser erva hu da asira tzarasa, halo isura iser erva tzarasa lo asira. But others learn no, that what our Mishnah is telling me is an exclusive rule. It's telling me that only when a woman is forbidden to me because she's related to me in some way. But if she's not related to me in some way, but rather her isser, or her failure to fall to yibum, is because of some external factor, because she's infertile, then her tzara is not prohibited, and I'm allowed to marry her tzara. And that's coming to lim'ute mai, amaraf from lim'ute tzaras ailanis udolok Ravasi. Therefore, it's to the exclusion of Ravasi that some learn that this Mishnah is indicative to the contrary of Ravasi, that a tzara of an ailanis does fall for yibum or chalitza. Okay. Achosa shehi yevimta. So we talked about a case where the sister is the Yevama. So achosa deman. So the question is, who is she the sister of? Ilema de isra mitzvah, keven de midioraisa ram yakamei paga ba'achosa kukasa. You can't tell me that one of the sisters only presents an Isser Mitzvah, which we said is an Isser D'Rabbanan to the Yavam, because if that's the case, then the other sister is Achos Zekukaso Midioraisa. She's the sister of a woman with whom I have Zika Midioraisa, so therefore I should only be able to do Chalitza with her. And yet the Mishnah says I can actually be Miyabim her. So Ella Achosa de Isser Erva. So rather, says the Gemara, we're talking about a case where there are two sisters. One is an actual erva midioraisa to me, and that's why I can do full yibum or chalitza to the other sister, because there's no zika whatsoever from the other sister. Isser mitzvah shenios. The Mishnah had then defined that what the term Isser mitzvah means is a woman who's rabbinically prohibited to me. So amai korile Isser mitzvah, amar Rabbi mitzvah lishma divrei chachamim. Why is it called Isser mitzvah if it's only a rabbinic prohibition? Because of the what? The mitzvah to listen to the words of the sages. That's why it's called Isser mitzvah. And Isser kedusha almana l'kohen gadol gusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedja. We said what's an example of Isser kedusha? When an almana falls to a kohen gadol for yibum, or a grusha falls to a regular kohen for yibum. So there's chalitza, but there's no yibum. So v'amai kari lehu Isser kedusha. Why is it called an Isser kedusha? D'chsiv kedoshim yu leilokeihem. The reason is because by the kohanim it says they have to be holy to their God. And since it is my kahuna which prohibits this woman to me, it's called an Isser kedusha. Tanya Rabbi Yehuda machlif Isser mitzvah amana l'kohen gadol grusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedjot. That Rabbi Yehuda in this brisa switches them around, and he says the term Isser mitzvah refers to a kohen prohibited to a grusha, and Isser Kedusha refers to a rabbinic prohibition. So the question is, V'mai kori le Isser mitzvah, why is a Kohen's prohibition to, or Kohen Gadol's prohibition to Alman, or Kohen's prohibition to a Grusha called Isser mitzvah? D'chsiv Eila ha-mitzvahs. Because if you look at the end of the book of Leviticus, which is all about the laws of the Levites, the Kohanim, it says the last pasuk is Eila ha-mitzvahs. These are the commandments. So therefore, the word mitzvah is related to Leviticus, and that's how I know. That's why it's called an Isser mitzvah. And Isser Kedusha, Shnios min divrei sofrim. So what does the word Isser Kedusha mean? It means those things that are relationships that are rabbinically prohibited. V'mai kori le Isser Kedusha. So why is it called Isser Kedusha? Amar Abaya kol hamekayim divrei chachamim nikra kadosh. Because, says Abaya, anyone who fulfills the commandments of the sages is called a holy person. So frek the Gemara, Amalei Rava v'chol she'enu makayim divrei chachamim kadosh u'delo mikri Russian lami lo mikri? Question mark. What does that mean? I'm a holy yid because I observe a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. So what does that imply? That if I don't fulfill the mitzvah d'Rabbanan, I'm not a holy yid, but I'm not a sinner either? That's not true. We know that can't be true. You can't be called a kadosh just because you follow halacha. So Ela Amar Rava Kadesh Atzmecha b'muter, but rather the word kedusha has to do with what the rabbi's project was. The project of the Chachamim was to prohibit women that are not biblically prohibited, so that they create a fence, a protective fence around the Torah, which is what the idea of Kadesh Atzmecha b'muter, sanctify yourself with things that are permitted for you, so that you won't come to violate the truly prohibited things.
Was the idea that they're listening to the Chachamim and doing that, or something separate?
No.
Answer now.
This is that was the previous version.
Right.
When it's the previous version, which calls Isser D'Rabbanan and Isser Mitzvah, because Mitzvah L'Shmoa Divrei Chachamim.
Right.
Here, why is it called Isser Kedusha? Because it's descriptive of what the Chazal had in mind when they instituted Isser Shenios, when they instituted the Isser of a great granddaughter, to sanctify Klal Yisrael with that which is permitted to us. Okay, next. Almana l'kohen gadol. So kapasik v'tani lo shna min hanisun v'lo shna min ha'erisim. We're going to go back to our discussion of asay docha los asay. The Gemara over here at this point is saying that when you look at the Mishnah does not distinguish how this woman is a widow. All we know is that if Ruvain dies and he leaves over a Yevama for Shimon, his Kohen Gadol brother. Maybe it was, Shimon is an appropriate name because Shimon HaTzadik was the Kohen Gadol of the chief Kohen Gadol of the Second Temple era. So Shimon HaTzadik turns out to be the Yavam. So he can't do Yibam, he can only do Chalitza. And this Mishnah does not distinguish whether this woman had only received Kiddushin from Reuven, but he had not consummated yet the marriage, or whether Reuven had consummated the marriage with Nisuin. And what's the difference? In one case, the girl could potentially still be a virgin, and in the other case, she's not a virgin. So, Bishlam min hanisuin aseh v'lo saseh vein aseh deichelo saseh va'aseh. So, in the situation where she's no longer a virgin because Reuven had consummated the marriage, I could clearly understand why Shimon can't do Yibam, because this woman has the stigma of a mitzvah lo saseh, the almana lo yikach, that a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry an almana. Plus, there's a mitzvah asay v'hu isha b'psuleha yikach, that he has to marry a woman when she's a besula, when she's a virgin. So, a mitzvah asay of yibum cannot override a double, both a lo asay and an asay together. Ela min ha'erisin lo asay greiduhu yavo asay v'yitcha lo asay. But, says the Gemara, what if Reuven's widow is only his widow from Kiddushin, so that she's still a virgin when she falls to Yibum? There's only a mitzvah lo saseh, that he's not allowed to marry an almana. Why don't we say that the mitzvah aseh of Yibum should override the standard mitzvah lo saseh of do not marry an almana? Why can't you say that? So the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Gidol, Amar Rav, Amar Kra, Va'olsa Yevimto Hashaira. He says it's based on a pasuk. Now, if you look at the pasuk, I don't know if you have the full pasuk with you. My Gemara, it has the full pasuk. It says that if a man does not want to do yibum to the Yevama, so Va'olsa Yevimto Hashaira, then the Yevama shall go up to the gates of the sages, Va'amra V'me'en Yevami, and she'll say that my Yavam refuses to do Yibum with me. Now the word Yevimto is mentioned twice. It first says Vimlo Yachposish Lakachas is Yevimto. also Yevimto Hashara. Why does it have to say the word Yevimto, his Yevama, twice in that pasuk? Shein Tamalomer Yevimto, Ma Tamalomer Yevimto, that Yesh Lecha Yevama Acheres Sha'ola Lechalitza Ve'ina Ola Liyibum. This pasuk is coming to teach me that there are some Yevamas that if you want to do Yibum, you can. That's what the first part of the pasuk was addressing. But there are other kinds of Yevamas where even if you want to do Yibum, you're not able to because the Torah prohibits you from doing Yibum and you can only do Chalitza. So ve'ezozu chayve lavin. What is that? This refers to a woman who has an isser lav upon her, like an almana to a kohen gadol. So therefore, even though normally we would say asay doichalos asay, but here because we have an explicit pasuk that is coming to exclude such a woman, that's why he can't do yibum. He can only do chalitza. So the Gemara says, one second, you're telling me now that there's a special verbiage to tell me that you can only do chalitza to some Yevamas and not yibum? Ve'imachaybe krisus. Maybe that's referring to a woman that's an Isser Kares. Also, you have to do chalitza. Omar kra im lo yachbot sa'ish lakachas hachafetz miyabe. And that teaches me kol ola liyubam ola lachalitza v'chol shein ola liyubam ein ola lachalitza. No, because the pasuk at the first part says that if the man does not want to marry the Yevama, then he can do chalitza, which teaches me that that chalitza and yibum go hand in hand. The first part of the pasuk seems to imply that they're interrelated. Anytime a man wants to, he can do yibum, and if not, if he doesn't want to do yibum, he can do chalitza. But you can't have a situation where you can only do chalitza and not do yibum. So ihachi chayve lavin nami. But if that's the case, then how could you have said just the opposite when it comes to a chayve lavin? So harabi rachmani yevimto. But that's what the extra word Yevama is for. So the Gemara says umarois. So how do you know that the first part of the pasuk is talking about a chayve krisus and the second part is talking about chayve lavin? The Gemara answers mistaver chayve lavin tafsi buhu kiddushin chayve krisus lo tafsi buhu kiddushin. The answer is it's logic. Logic dictates that the first part of the pasuk, which is talking about wanting to marry a woman, must be talking about chayve krisus, and like Rashi points out on the bottom, he says hilkach karinan ba lakachas. Therefore, that the part of the pasuk that talks about marrying her must be talking about a woman that could have tvisas kiddushin. Aval chayve krisus lo tafsibu kiddushin vafilo over hayavam v'nasva lav kichahi. And therefore, even if the yavam were to go ahead and marry her, that would not be considered a marriage. And therefore, it's just logic dictates that chayve lavin who have tfisas kedushin are people who are subject to chalitza because there's some connection there, and chayve krisus have no connection whatsoever because there's no tfisas kedushin, and therefore the pasuk is saying that when there's no yibum, there's no chalitza, there's nothing. That's just logical. So Masiv Rava. So Rava now challenges this whole premise. Remember, the premise now is that there is a certain kind of woman who only has an isser lav that is subject to chalitza but not subject to yibum. So Isra mitzvah ve'isra kedusha ba'aleha ochalatzla niftarat sarasa. So the Brisa says that if a woman is either an Isra mitzvah, which we had said before is an Isra d'Rabbanan, or an Isra kedusha, which is like a lo sase, like an almana to a kohen gadol, so the halacha is that if a man does have relations with her for the sake of yibum, or if he does chalitza to her, then the tzara becomes pater also because he's dispensed with the mitzvah. V'yisal kadaita chayve lavin mid'yoraisa lachalitza rama liyibum lo ramya ki bo aleha my niftarat sarasa. My question to you is if you're telling me that a woman who's chayve lavin never even falls to yibum, she only falls for chalitza, then why is it that if the man illicitly goes ahead and is intimate with her, then he's fulfilled his mitzvah to the point where the tzara is now exempt? There was no mitzvah of yibum to this woman who's a chayve lavin. So how can you tell me that his intimacy with her dispensed with the mitzvah to the family, to the point where the tzar is now off the hook? So the Gemara answers, "Hu mosiv la v'hu mefarek la litzdadin kitani." that Rava was the one who asked the question from the Brisa, and he figured out an answer also. He says that this Brisa is supposed to be read in a bifurcated way. And the way you read it is like this: Ba'aleha isr mitzvah, chalatzla isr kedusha. That when it says that when the man is intimate with her, he dispenses with the mitzvah for the whole family, for both wives, that's referring to an isr mitzvah, when there's only an isr derabanan to preclude him from marrying her. But when it says that we're talking about an Isser Kedusha, which is an Isser Deoraisa, that part is only going on the part where it says that if he does Chalitza with her. So you have a way of wiggling out of the Brisa without it contradicting what we've just said. Masiv Rava. Now Rava challenges from another Brisa. Pitzua daka uchur shuvcha suris adam vehazakein ocholtzin o miyabed. That the halacha is like this: that if a man dies and he leaves over a wife and a brother, but the brother is in some way injured to the point where he has his reproductive organs have been injured so that he's not capable of reproduction. So in that case, nonetheless, we still allow either chalitza or yibum for that brother, who's the what we call a pitzua daka or a krus shavcha. So keitza. So what's the case? Mesu vilahem nashim vilahem achin. So first of all, the Gemara is going to tell us the first case, which is where the man who dies is himself the pitzua daka or the krus shavcha. That's the first part of the brisa, where the decedent is the person whose reproductive organs have been injured. So in that case, if the pitzua daka dies and he leaves over a wife, so then va'amdu achin va'asu mamar b'neshosein v'nasnu geit v'choltzu masha asu v'imboalu kan. So in that situation, then the brother, she falls to yibum. And if a brother goes ahead and gives her a mimer, gives her a get, gives her chalitza, or does yibum, all of those actions are effective to whatever respective degree they are effective. We know, we'll see from the Gemara later on, that if one of the brothers gives her a get, even though get is not the proper mechanism for creating severance from a Yevama, he precludes her from doing yibum with any of the other brothers. Okay, fine. Now, mesu achim va'amdu heim va'asu mamer b'neshoseim v'nasnu geito shalchatzu o shechaltzu masha asu. Now, what if the brother who was healthy is the brother who was married and dies, and she falls to yibum to a krus shavcha, to a man whose reproductive organs have been damaged? So, if they do chalitza, if they do a get, if they do a mimer, all of these are legitimate acts. And if the pitzua daka or the krus shavcha actually tries to do yibum and he has intimacy with her, then halachically he's fulfilled the mitzvah of yibum, but he can't stay married to her because the Torah prohibits a pitzua daka of being married to a regular Israelite woman. So the question now, yes?
Sorry, compare this to Islanders. We don't have the same criteria, I don't think.
What?
If you compare this to Islanders.
If you compare this to what?
Islanders.
Yes, right, correct. It's not. They're not parallel. So the Gemara's now point is, the question is like this: the Ital kadaita chayve lavin midioraisa lechalitza ramya liibam lo ramya. The question is, if you're telling me that anyone who has an isser lav upon them does not even have the mitzvah of yibum, only has the mitzvah of chalitza, how can you tell me that a pitzua daka who had intimacy with this woman for yibum has fulfilled the mitzvah? He hasn't. She didn't fault him for yibum at all. And so the Gemara says in Balu Amaikana, so then why are they considered married if he has bia with her? So Elor Omar Rava, so Rava says you're right. We're going to reject that concept. Really, anyone who has an Isser Lav really does fall both to Yibum and Chalitza. And there's no such thing as a woman only falling for Chalitza, not for Yibum. But really, an Almana to a Kohen Gadol really does fall to Yibum, regardless of whether she's just an Isser Lav or an Isser Lav and an Isser Aseh. But Almana, min ha'erisin nami aseh velos asehu. But an Almana who falls to Yibum to a Kohen Gadol, there too, the reason why he can't do Yibum is not because there's no mitzvah of Yibum, but rather because there's a mitzvah aseh and a mitzvah los aseh involved. And therefore, a mitzvah aseh of Yibum cannot override a los aseh and an aseh together. D'chsiv kedoshim yihiyu lelokeim. Because as the Torah says, a positive commandment to any Kohen that they have to be holy to their God. So even though this woman is only an almana, she's also a virgin, but there's an additional mitzvah aseh of kedoshim yihiyu. So now Gemara says, but wait a minute, mamzeres unasina ma'ikal meimar. But what are you going to say about a mamzeres unasina, where at most there's only an isser lav, there's no isser aseh? Why don't you say the mitzvah of yibum overrides the isser to a mamzer? The Gemara says, but there too there's a mitzvah aseh, because ksiv v'hiskadishtem, because the Torah says you shall sanctify yourself, and that is a blanket statement that you have to fulfill sanctity in your marriage, no matter what. So the Gemara says, "Ihachi kol haTorah kula nami aseh v'lo sa'aseh hu dichsiv v'hiskadishtem." Well, if that's the case, anytime there's a mitzvah lo saseh, there will always be accompanied by a mitzvah saseh. You can never have a situation of aseh doicha lo saseh, because anytime you don't follow the Torah, you're not fulfilling the positive commandment of be holy. So therefore, the Gemara says you're right. You can't say that there's like this blanket mitzvah aseh that accompanies every mitzvah lo saseh. Ela amar Rava gezera almana min ha'eresin atu almana min ha'nesuin. I'll tell you the real reason. Really, aseh is doicha lo saseh. Really, biblically, a Kohen Gadol should be allowed to do yibum to an almana, if she only has a mitzvah lo saseh upon her. But the rabbis forbade it and required only to do chalitza. Why? Because if we allow you to do yibum with this almana who's a virgin, next time you'll come to do yibum to an almana who's not a virgin. So the Gemara now says, but wait a minute, mamzeres unasina ma'ika l'meimar gzeir b'makom mitzvah tu shelo b'makom mitzvah. So what are you going to do by a mamzeres, a woman who's a mamzer? So what are you going to say? What's the fear over there? There too, there's also a fear. Even though aseh is doichalos, aseh, if we allow you to marry a mamzeres in the case of yibum, you'll come to marry a mamzeres when there's no mitzvah of yibum. So ela me'ata eshes achiv me'aviv lo tisyabim gzera mishum eshes achiv me'ima. Well, if you're going to start making rabbinic injunctions, whenever you're worried that if we allow you to do this, you may come to do this, then we should never allow you to do yibum to your brother's wife, lest you come to do yibum with your brother's to your brother's wife when he's your maternal brother, not your paternal brother. So the Gemara says, "Yibum benachal atala rachmana meida yadia." Answers more, no, we're not concerned about that, because since the Torah clearly connects yibum to the mitzvah of inheritance, you'll never make that error. You'll always know that it's always to your paternal brother, not to your maternal brother. But isha she'en labanim lo tisyabem gzera mishum isha sheyesh labanim. The Gemara says, well, let me give you another idea of a gezerah. You should never let a woman do yibum, even though she falls to yibum without children, because if we let you marry your brother's widow who doesn't have kids, you'll come to marry your brother's widow when she has kids, and that's clearly not, and there's no yibum there. The Gemara says, "Bebonim tala rachmana meida yadia." There, the Gemara says we're also not worried, because since the Torah says that the whole objective of yibum is to have children with this woman to build your brother's household, you'll know that it's got to do with having kids. So if she already has kids, there's no mitzvah of yibum. But eishes achiv shahaya ba'olama lo tisyabim gzera mishum eishes achiv shelo haya ba'olama. But let me make another gezerah. You should never do yibum, even when you're alive, when your brother dies, lest you come to permit a case of Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, that you'll let Levi do yibum to Ruvain's widow, even though Levi wasn't alive. So the Gemara says, "V'yeshiva tala rachmana meidi yadia." There too, the Torah says, "Ki yeshvu achim yachdav," and two brothers live together. So since the pasuk is explicit about that, you won't make the mistake. But the Gemara says, but furthermore, you can make another gezerah. Kol anoshim lo tisyabena gezerah mishum ailanis. But then no woman should be able to get yibum, lest if we allow you to marry your brother's wife when she's fertile, you may come to do yibum with a woman who's not fertile, like an ailanis. So the Gemara says, nah, lo shchicha. That's not common. The rabbis are not worried that you're going to do yibum with a woman who's infertile, because it's such an uncommon occurrence for a woman to be infertile. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, by that token, mamzeres unasina nami lo shchicha. Why should we ever forbid you to do yibum to a mamzeres just because, you may come to marry a mamzeres when there's no mitzvah? It's not common to find a mamzeres. So, bichlal, why should the rabbis come in and institute a prohibition to a mamzeres? So, ela omar rava gezerah biyur rishona atu biyashni. So here's really the final answer. Really, mitzvahs aseh is doicha mitzvahs lo saseh. And there is a mitzvah of yibum, and midioraisa, you should be allowed to perform yibum to a woman where there's a mitzvahs lo saseh. Why don't we allow it? Because the mitzvah of yibum is only for the first biyah, the first act of intimacy. Any subsequent act of intimacy, you're not technically fulfilling the mitzvah of yibum. You're just living with your wife. So, if we allow you to do the mitzvah of Yibum with the first act of intimacy, then the halacha would really require you to now divorce her afterwards, because she's a mitzvah lo saseh. There's a mitzvah lo saseh upon her of being a grusha to a kohen, for example. And so therefore we're worried though, but if we allow you to do one act of intimacy, you may come to do a second act, and therefore we tell you no. Don't even do the first act, and therefore do chalitza right away.
Isn't the whole point of Yibum to build your brother's family?
Correct.
Until he has a child?
No. So the Chazal have a different understanding. You're right. The Psukim seem to indicate that you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah until you actually have children through her. But Chazal... What? Chazal do not understand it that way. Chazal say it's the very act of one attempt of being married to her makes you fulfill that mitzvah. Because you could live with her for years and never impregnate her, but you've still fulfilled the mitzvah with the first act of intimacy. Okay, so the Gemara now says, Tanya no mihachi, we have a brisa to support this. Im ba'alo kano b'via rishona v'asu l'kaiman b'via sheniya. That the brisa says explicitly that midioraisa, if you do yibum, then you fulfill the mitzvah of yibum, but you have to divorce her right afterwards because you can't live with a woman as a mitzvah lo saseh. So that clearly indicates that there is a mitzvah of yibum for a woman where there's a mitzvah lo saseh. Hadar Amar Rava, but then Rava retracted, and as we'll see, the Gemara is not happy about Rava's retraction because really Rava is correct in his first assertion. But Rava retracted, and Vitema Ravashi, and some say that it was Ravashi who retracted, and he says, Lav Milsi da Amr. I'm actually not happy with what I said. Da Amr Reish Lakish, Kol Makom Shatamotze Ase Velo Sase, Imatayachal Akaim Shneim Muta, Vim Lav Yavo Ase V'yidches Lo Sase. Hachanami Efsher B'chalitza to Mekayim Ase Velo Sase. So the Gemara says, no. Really, we don't say Ase Doicha Lo Sase, that a positive mitzvah of Yibum can override the negative commandment. The only time we say that is if there's no other possibility. But when there's an opportunity to not violate the mitzvahs lo saseh and still fulfill the mitzvahs aseh, then it's efshel l'kayim shneim, as we say, then you're not allowed to have aseh doicha lo saseh. So therefore, according to Reish Lakish, you can't do yibum, even midioraisa, to a woman where there's a mitzvahs lo saseh, because you have an alternative option of doing chalitza. See, Reish Lakish views chalitza as an equally viable alternative to yibum, and therefore he says you don't say aseh doicha lo saseh over there. So the Gemara says meisvei. What about the brisa which says v'im ba'alo kano, that if you do have relations with her, you fulfill the mitzvah of yibum? And according to you, Reish Lakish, there's no opportunity for yibum whatsoever because we don't allow an aseh to be doicha lo saseh. So there's bichlal no mitzvah of yibum there. So the Gemara answers to Yuvta, that's a refutation to Reish Lakish. And so the Gemara goes back to the Rava's original position, which is really Aseh is Doicha Lo Saseh for the Bia Rishona, for the first act of intimacy. But the rabbis forbade even the first act of intimacy for Yibum, lest you come to do a second act. Have a wonderful Shabbos and a good Chodesh.